Good morning. It is good to see you. If you were not here this past week for Bible school, I don't know what to tell you except that you missed it. Nita and her team just did an incredible job. This place was packed. Most nights they had these bubble machines. I get to see the balcony crew. I had these bubble machines. We're going to put those back in like when you least expect it. You're going to think you're underwater, like you fallen asleep and woke up underwater. They also raised a great amount of money for the pregnancy center, which you'll hear more about at the end of the service, which explains why I'm wearing this incredibly stylish shirt. We're going to auction this off at the end of the second service. We're going to start the bidding at free. So if you want it, you just let me know, and you can take it home with you today. Also, if you see Anita, make sure you give her a pat on the back. This past week, she's certainly been the MVP, so we're thankful for her and for all of you who were part of that. And if you missed it, just remember next year you'll want to be a part of this. Now, I want to ask you a question. What is the most valuable thing that you own? I want you to just think about that for a second. What's the most valuable thing that you own? Now, that may be hard to pinpoint because there are different types of values. So there's fair market value, there's functional value, there's social value, there's sentimental value. Probably the easiest is just, monetary value. So maybe you have a bank account somewhere that's got a certain amount of money in it, so you know what it's worth. Maybe you own a certain number of acres and you know about what each acre is worth, so you can quickly do the math. Maybe you own a certain percentage of a business, and if you were pressed, you could come up with a number. Those things are normally easiest, but maybe as you heard that question, your mind went to one particular thing, and you said, this is obviously the most valuable thing that I own. Or maybe you had a whole list of things, and you'd have to go back and sort of calculate each thing to figure out what would be the top. But here's what you need to know. Whatever it is you identified, whether it's one thing or a whole list of things, what you need to know is that the thing that you identified as being the most valuable thing you own is not, in fact, the most valuable thing you own. Now, there are a lot of different ways to think about that, but the most valuable thing you own is something that you probably rarely think about, at least consciously, but unconsciously, it's always in the back of your mind. For most of us, it's such a huge part of our lives that we are rarely, if ever, unaware of it. And if you think about it hard enough, you'll find that the most valuable thing you own has nothing to do with money, has everything to do with time. Now, sometimes we forget that, but deep down inside, all of us know. That's why you wear a watch. It's why even though church gets out at the same time, every single week, within 5 minutes, some of you are going to be doing this. You're going to be looking to see how much time is left. That's why every room you walk into has a clock somewhere on the wall. One of the things that has a lot of sentimental value for me is the grandfather clock that used to be in my grandparents' living room and is now in our living room. So every hour, it lets out this soothing tone that lets you know exactly what time it is. But even that wasn't good enough for my grandpa, so here's what he did. He set it up to where it would ring every 15 minutes. So every 15 minutes it rings, letting you know that it's now 15 minutes later than it was 15 minutes earlier. You've probably got some things like that too. Then, of course, there are phones. Every time you pull out your phone, what's the first thing you see? The time and the date, this subtle reminder that time is quickly passing. Now, if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Psalm 90. If you're using your phone, just look at the time and date and then turn to Psalm 90. For the last month, we've been in this series we've called Sandcastles, which we've been talking about learning to choose the eternal over the temporary instead of obsessing over temporary things. And to help us think through some of these things, we've basically been looking at different sections that are part of what's called the Sermon on the Mount. But today, we want to take it back a little further to the Old Testament, to Psalm 90. Now, in every generation, there are certain songs that if you were a member of that generation, all you have to do is just hear the first line or sometimes the first note of the song, and you immediately recognize it because it's so embedded in your memory. Psalm 90 was kind of like that for the members of the early church. It was one of the most popular psalms, and the reason for that is that it was probably the oldest, in addition to being written by a guy named Moses. Now, most times if you grew up in church, you just assume that King David wrote all the Psalms, and that's usually true, but Psalm 90 is the one that we're certain of that was written by Moses. I mean, he may have written more, but we know he wrote Psalm 90. If you remember his story, it's really incredible. He spends the first 40 years of his life as a prince of Egypt. He's the adopted son of Pharaoh. But then because of a decision to kill an Egyptian, he spends the second 40 years as a shepherd out in the wilderness, sort of living in obscurity on the run from the law. And then right when you think the story's about to end, when he turns 80, God comes to him completely unexpectedly and tells him, I want you to go back to Egypt. I want you to lead the Hebrew people out of Egyptian slavery into the promised land. So from one angle, it's hard to imagine anybody who had a more diverse background than Moses. He grew up in the palace, literally, got the world at his fingertips. Then he spends what should have been, the best years of his life in terms of building an empire and building a career, living in obscurity, far removed from the spotlight that he had once occupied. And then at the age of 80, overnight, he becomes a global leader. And it's through all those ups and downs, through all those different challenges, sitting on top of the world and at rock bottom and then trying to do this insurmountable challenge, that Moses learns some things about life that he wants future generations to know. And so he writes them down in what we know of as Psalm 90. Now, if you're a person who's really into the details of certain passages, there have been entire books written about some of the technical things that Moses did with the Hebrew and the grammar in the original. But if you want to look that up on your own, feel free. But for our purposes this morning, they're just sort of three big ideas. And then he talks about at the end our response to it. So what we're going to do, we're just going to walk through this very simply, point out the three big ideas that Moses highlights, and then talk about our response to it. So if you're keeping track in your bulletin or on the FCC app, here's the first big idea. It's the idea that God is eternal. Check out verse 1 of Psalm 90. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. So the very first thing that Moses wants us to know is that God is eternal. There's never been a moment when he wasn't there. Before the world was created, before the mountains were born, he was there. He's from everlasting to everlasting. So empires come and go, civilizations come and go, political leaders come and go, entire nations come and go, entire generations come and they're born and they live and they build and they achieve and then they die and they pass off the scene and they hand it off to a new generation, and the whole time God is there. One of the big news stories over the last week you probably saw were some of the pictures that have been released that were taken by the James Webb Telescope. Here's an example of one that you might have seen in the news. This is let me get this right, the Carina Nebula. And according to NASA, it's located 7,500 light years away from the earth. The reason these pictures, though, are so important is that, according to the researchers, the pictures that the James Webb Telescope takes can see much further and with much more clarity than the Hubble Telescope that was launched 10 years ago. So you think about the phone you had 10 years ago, the pictures it would take compared to the pictures today, and you start to understand that they hope to be able to make discoveries about our galaxies, about space, that they otherwise would not have been able to make. So in some of the coverage of the event, these different news organizations, they went back and they interviewed people who have actually been to space. And they wanted to get their response to some of these images that are now being released. It was interesting. Time magazine pointed out in all the space programs throughout all history, there's still only been 600 people who have traveled to space. One of them was a guy named David Beaver, who was a part of the Apollo 8 mission, which was the first manned mission to reach the moon. I've got a picture that he took. Some of you have seen this before, a very famous picture that he took during the Apollo 8 mission from the moon, looking back at the Earth. It's one of the most famous pictures in history. So in this interview with Time magazine, David Beaver talked about how every single person who's ever been to space, when they come back, they talk about what NASA now calls the overview effect. And what they mean by that is that once you see Earth from the perspective of outer space, everything on Earth starts to look different when you get back. Here's the way David Beaver explained it. He said, when we originally went to the moon, our total focus was on the moon. We went without thinking about looking back at the earth. But now that we've done it, that may well have been the most important reason we went. He went on to explain how when you see the earth from the perspective of outer space, it just looks so different. All the stuff that keeps you up at night, all the stuff that you worry about, all the stuff that you're chasing after from a different perspective, from the perspective of space, starts to look really small and inconsequential. From the perspective of outer space, the empire that you think you're building is smaller than a grain of sand. And I think that's exactly what Moses is doing here in the first two verses of Psalm 90. He's trying to get us to understand that we live and work and breathe and move and build our lives and grow old and even die in a context that most of us never think about. Most of us fall into the trap. We think like the bookends of our lives are like birth and death. And you read an obituary, that's what it says. Here's the day this person was born, and then we sort of skip over the middle, and here's the day this person died. But that's not it. From the perspective of heaven, from the perspective of God, the bookends are not birth and death. It's everlasting to everlasting, because before you were born, God was there. And long after you're gone, God will be there. That means the context for your existence is not you, it's God. He was here before you arrived, and He'll be here after you're gone. Now here's the second big idea that Moses wants us to know, and that's that life is short. Check out verse 3. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. Yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up new, but by evening it is dry and withered. We are consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. What Moses is doing, he's describing for us the devastating effects of sin. And one of the effects of sin that we rarely think about is how it has impacted and shortened our lifespan. That's what sin does. It pollutes, it destroys, and it disintegrates. And one of the things, as I said, that we rarely think about is our life expectancy. So you go back to verse 3, it says, you turn people back into dust. That's a reference to Genesis 3, direct quote, where God comes down and He announces the consequences of sin. Now you compare that to what Moses said in verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 90, and it's clear that he's contrasting the eternality, the eternal nature of God with the transience of us. God is like this mountain. In fact, He's bigger than a mountain. He created the mountains, and we are like dust. We are like grains of sand when compared to God. That's why from God's perspective, our lives pass by in the blink of an eye. In verse 4, He tells us that to God, 1,000 years are like a day, or a watch in the night, which was a single 3 to 4 hour period. So if that's true, if a day's like 1,000 years, that means that even if you live to be 100 years old, your entire life passes by God like a 2-hour period. Less time it takes to watch the average basketball game or the average movie. Then if that doesn't get your attention, verse 5, he says, we're all like grass. We spring up in the morning, look pretty good, but then the sun comes out and the air heats up, and by the afternoon, we're dry and withered. Aren't you glad you came to church today? Very encouraging. Look at verse 10. Our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures, yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly. It's amazing thing. I looked it up this week. This psalm, best we can tell, was written about 1400 BC, which would make it about 3,500 years old. And yet, do you know what the life expectancy is in America today? I looked it up this week. For the average man, 76.1. The average woman, it's 81.1 years. Now, I don't know what the discrepancy is, but it's there. You average them together, it comes out to 78.6 years. Now, obviously, some people do better than that. I mean, Moses was a guy that did better than Deuteronomy 34 tells us that he lived to be 120, and even when he came to his last day, his eyes were not weak and his strength was not gone, which meant he was pretty strong for a guy of 120. But that's the exception that proves the rule. I mean, that's why whenever somebody you know turns 90, you know what you do? You make a big deal out of it and you throw a party because you instinctively know that most people don't make it to 90. And even if they do, Moses makes it clear that it's not easy. Anytime after 80, he says your years will be but sorrow and trouble. Wayne Smith was one of my heroes, preached at Southland Christian in Lexington for 40 years, and who himself defied all the odds and lived to be 87 years old. He used to say there are 3 stages of life. There's youth, there's midlife, and then there's this period that he called, you're looking good. Somebody comes up to you and says, hey, you're looking good. And what he wanted people to know, what Moses wants us to know, is that transition from youth to midlife to you're looking good is a lot quicker than most of us want to realize. James, the half-brother of Jesus, said it like this. He said, now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city, we'll spend a year there, we'll carry on business and make money, while you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist, not a mountain. You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. And here's the third thing that Moses communicates in this psalm, and this may be the hardest pill to swallow of all of them. It's that the clock is already ticking. Look at what he says in verse 11. If only we knew the power of your anger. Your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. I've got a picture I want to show you. There is a website that you can go to. Go to the next picture. There is a website that you can go to. It's called deathclock.com. And it's a very encouraging title, I know. But you go, and the homepage pops up, and it gives you a series of 4 or 5 questions. You know, your height, your weight, you know, are you a pessimist or an optimist or, you know, somewhere in the middle, which is a tough question. And then it takes all the information and it calculates your BMI. You know what that is? Your body mass index, which is always uncomfortable. I've discovered, like for me, I was talking to Joe Brown about this, my problem is not that I'm overweight, it's that I'm too short. And some of you can relate to that. I don't know who comes up with those formulas, man, but it's completely unreasonable, whoever it is. But they take all the information, and then you hit this button, and it comes back with the day you're supposed to die. So this is mine. If this holds true, I'm going to take my last breath on Thursday, October 24th, 2069, which if that holds true, that means I'll be just 2 months shy of 86 years old, which I actually thought, hey, I'll take it. That sounds pretty good. That would mean I have about 46 years left, which also sounds pretty good. But if you look closer, it breaks it down even more. So it gives you the seconds that you've got left to live. So for me, it's 1,491,390,334 seconds. Now here's the problem with this. When I did this earlier this week, I was working on the sermon, so I took out my phone and I went to the deathclock.com and I put in my information, as uncomfortable as that was, and I watched it, and then I put my phone back down and I went back to work. So about 3 hours later, I picked up my phone to check a text message, and I pulled it up, and you know what was still going? The death clock. And it was spinning down. So 3 hours later, my number was different. It was 1,491,379,544 seconds. In 3 hours, I lost 10,800 seconds. Now, before you pull your phone out and put your information in, just know these guys don't really know anything. After the first service, Al Denny, who's a member here, came up to me and said, "Preacher, I got a problem." I said, "What is it?" He said, "I just did the death clock, and it came back August 7th, 1999. So I don't know, like, that would be a problem. But if you want me to just make up a number and give it to you, I can do that without you putting your number. These guys don't know, but here's the one thing they do know. The clock's ticking. Whether you got 40 years or 4 years or 40 minutes or whatever it is, I mean, the clock is already counting down. There's nothing you can do about that. And I know we don't like to think about it, and to be honest, a lot of us will go to incredible lengths to avoid having to think about it. But when you get to verse 12, Moses makes it clear there's incredible value in knowing that the clock is ticking. In fact, the way he says it, he says there's some kind of intrinsic link between knowing that your time is limited and making better decisions as to how you're going to use your limited time. Got another picture. Back in 2005, the commencement speaker at Stanford University's graduation was the CEO of Apple, Steve Jobs. Now, the title of his remarks, you can Google this. It's been a very famous speech. Some of you probably heard this. It's titled, How to Live Before You Die. And what made it so powerful is that just a few months before he gave the speech, he thought he had some kidney stones, so he went to the emergency room. They did a CT scan looking for kidney stones, and when they did, the doctors saw what looked like a shadow on his pancreas. So they started to investigate further. The end result was it's diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. So in this speech, he talks about, in the first half of the speech, he talked about what it was like to live with all of that uncertainty. Then he got to the second half of the speech, and he talked about what it's like to live every day knowing that you could die within months. And towards the end of his speech, he made a statement I thought was so powerful. He said, remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Read that again. He said, remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered for making the big choices in life. He went on to explain how part of his daily routine from that point forward is he would get up every morning, he'd get ready for work, he'd stand in front of the mirror, and he would ask himself, if I knew that today was going to be my last day on earth, would I spend it doing what I'm about to do? And he said, if I said no to that question too many days in a row, then I knew I had to make some changes. Now here's a guy, the CEO of probably the most influential company in the world. I mean, the iPhone, the iPad, all the stuff that we take for granted. I mean, when he died, his net worth was in the tens of billions of dollars. And he said, the most valuable thing I've ever learned is to stand in front of the mirror and ask myself, if I knew I was going to be dead soon, are these the decisions I would be making? Because there's something valuable about knowing that the clock is already ticking. So let's recap. Here's the 3 big ideas. God is eternal, life is short, and the clock is ticking. Now, if all those things are true, I mean, if Moses got this right, and I think he did, then what do? There's only one logical response, and it's this. We have to seek satisfaction in God alone. Look at what Moses says in verse 13. Relent, Lord, how long will it be? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen trouble. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. So the verse I want you to pay attention to is verse 14, where he writes, satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. So you've read this whole passage, and the whole time it's been focused on how hard life is and how fast it goes. And then you get to the verse 14, and it's like there's this shift in tone. I mean, up until this point, it's been all negative. We're consumed by God's anger. We're terrified of his wrath. Our years finish with a moan. And even if we do live for a long time, our years are going to be but sorrow and trouble. But then you get to verse 14. And instead of talking about moaning and agony, he's talking about singing songs of joy. So what is it that makes the difference? How do you transition from a short life filled with trouble to spending your days singing for joy? It all comes down to one thing. where do you find your satisfaction? To be satisfied with something literally means to be fulfilled. Or another way to think about it would be to say that within each of us there is this hole. Blaise Pascal, the philosopher, called it a God-shaped vacuum. And so what happens is that at some point in our lives, and maybe you're there right now, maybe you're feeling it right now, you know that there is this gnawing emptiness. It's like there's this hole somewhere deep inside you, and you can feel it, and you know it's there. So here's what most people do. We admit it's there, and then we try to start filling it with whatever we think will fill that hole and take away that vacuum. So for some people, it's money and possessions. For other people, it's power or fame or recognition. For a lot of people in our culture, it's love and acceptance. So I'm going here and I'm going there, and one relationship to the next, and one job to the next, and one place to the next. And it's like they're always chasing something that's just out of reach. And then somewhere along the way, they realize that the clock is ticking. It's like every 15 minutes, they hear that bell go off. And so there's one or two things that people do, one of two things. Some people, when they realize that there's more time behind them than in front of them, they start to intensify their efforts. So they work that much harder, they go that much faster, they become that much more desperate, more reckless in their attempts to find something that can fill that hole, something that can bring fulfillment. Other people take a different approach, and instead of intensifying their efforts, they just sort of resign themselves and say, this is as good as it's ever going to be. It's not bad, it's not great, but this is what it's going to be, and I'm just going to sort of resign myself. And so rather than spending their days singing songs of joy, they feel unfulfilled. And as Moses says, as they get closer and closer to the end, they're not singing songs of joy, they're moaning. And rather than looking forward in anticipation, they spend most of their time looking into the past, filled with regret. So you look at what Moses said in verse 14. There's only one thing that can fill that vacuum, and it's God's unfailing love. Blaise Pascal said it like this. He said, there is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man, which cannot be filled by any created thing, because created things are temporary, but only by God the Creator, made known through Jesus Christ. See, the mistake that most of us make, we spend our lives trying to fill this hole with temporary stuff. And we ignore the one person who can satisfy us permanently. The ancient thinker Augustine said it like this. He said, you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. Listen how Moses says this in verse 17. May the favor of the Lord our God rest on us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. So last few weeks we've been talking about the idea of everything around us is temporary, and the foolishness of spending our lives chasing temporary things. But then you get to verse 17, and Moses all of a sudden flips the script, and he talks about something that's permanent. How do you give yourself to something permanent? It starts when you find your satisfaction in God's unfailing love. And somehow in the process of all that, as He becomes the most important thing, and as you grow closer to Him, He begins to establish the work of your hands, because you're doing things that are close to His heart. You quit worrying about the empire that you're building, and you start to focus on the kingdom that He wants to build through you. The problem is that we forget. So I want to help you remember. Inside your bulletin this morning, you should have found a card. Looks like this. We've got a picture of it. If you didn't grab one on your way in, grab one on your way out. There's a short, just 3-sentence prayer, 3 lines. Take you about 10 seconds to pray this every morning. But if you'll do this on a consistent basis, and if you'll get to a place where you actually mean it, it'll change how you approach your day. Help you make better decisions. It will allow you to put yourself in a better position for God to work through you to establish the work of your hands. Here's what it says. Lord, remind me to live like my days are numbered. Help me to focus on what really matters. Remind me to seek satisfaction in you alone. And if you'll pray that and you'll do that, rather than spending your life chasing after temporary things, you'll find yourself contributing to things that are permanent. Now, I want you to stand with me. When I started today, I asked you a question, and the question was, what is the most valuable thing you own? And I hope you understand that the most valuable thing you own is also your most limited resource. It's the one thing you can't buy more of, the one thing you cannot create. There's nothing you can do to get more. But I want to close today by asking you a follow-up question. Every great interviewer asks a follow-up question. So here's the follow-up question. If, for some unexpected reason, you were to run out of the most valuable thing you own, what would happen then? Now, some of you never think about that question. You'll go to great lengths to keep from thinking about that question. But also know there's some people who think about it all the time, and you don't know the answer. So if you don't know the answer to that question, I'd love to talk with you, pray with you. We've got people that would love to help you figure out what your next step should be. And it may be different for everybody. I don't know where you are in all this. But if you want to pray with somebody, we're going to sing a couple songs. We had a couple join the church this morning, had a young man who his next step was baptism. Maybe that's you. Maybe that's the next thing you need to do. I don't know what it is for you, but if you want to pray with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, I'll be here.